play before. He'll work for that. So then you think, well, the rat's motivated. So the two rats go out there and they play, and so they're playing like dogs play, and everyone knows what that looks like. If you're, if you have any sense about dogs, they kind of go like this, and kids do that, and maybe you do that with your wife if you're going to play with her a little bit. my poor wife, man, when she had older siblings, and so she wasn't played with as much when she was little as she might have been. And I used to if you take a pillow, and you go like this 3 times, right? That means look out, a pillow is coming your way. So I'd go 1, 2, 3, whap! And she was completely dismayed at me. It's like, what do you do that for? And I thought, well, I eventually taught her that rule. The other thing I used to do... The other thing I used to do, is sometimes she'd come at me like this when we were playing around, and I'd grab her wrists and I'd knock her hands, her knuckles together, and she used to just get completely annoyed about that, and I thought, right? That's what you do. You just open your hands. Well, she didn't know that either, so she hadn't been played with enough when she was a little rat. And so, Anyway, so you let the little rats go out there, right? And so let's imagine one of them is 10% bigger than the other. And so the 10% bigger rat wins, because 10% is enough in rat weight to ensure that you're going to be the pinner rather than the pinnee. Okay, so that's fine. So the big rat pins the little rat, and now the big rat is the authority rat. And so then the next time that the rats play, the little rat has to invite the big rat to play. So the big rat's out there being cool, and the little rat pops up and, does the whole will you play with me thing, and the big rat will deign to play with him. But if you pair them repeatedly, unless the big rat lets the little rat win 30% of the time, the little rat will not invite him to play. And Panksepp discovered that. It's like I read that just blew me away. It's like, that is so amazing, because you see, well, first of there's an analogy to Piaget's ideas about the emergence of morality out of play in human beings, so that was very cool. But the notion that was built into rats at the level of wrestling was, and they're social, they're deeply social animals, right? They have to know how to get along with one another. And most of their authority disputes, dominance disputes, you don't want them to end in bloodshed and combat. Because, if you're rat 1 and I'm rat 2 and we tear each other to shreds in a dominance dispute, rat 3 is just going to move in. It's really not a great strategy. And so it'd be better if we could settle our differences, somewhat peacefully. And so rats, anyways, Panksepp figured out that rats play. And not only that they play fair, and they seem to enjoy it. He also figured out, this was really cool too, that if you give juvenile rats attention deficit disorder drugs, Ritalin, suppresses play. So that's worth thinking about. It's like, well, why do you have to give juvenile human beings amphetamines in school. Well, because they need to play. Well, they don't get to play. They don't get to wrestle around. I mean, that's oppression as far as I can tell. They don't get to wrestle around. That's fine. Feed them some amphetamines, man. That'll shut down the old play circuits. Well, here's the other problem, is Panksepp found out that if you don't let juvenile male rats play, their prefrontal cortexes don't develop properly. Surprise, surprise, you're not letting them mature. It's like, what else would you expect? So, that's something to think about. Really hard, I would say. So there's some wolves going at it. Well, not exactly. There's some wolves having an authority dispute, let's more technically speaking. And a lot of it's posturing, they tend not, well-socialized wolves tend not to hurt each other during authority disputes because, well, for obvious reasons. It's too dangerous. And so they have other ways of demonstrating who should be listened to, authorities. And there's chimps doing that. This particular, now, I think, if I remember correctly, I think it's right. This is a really cool picture because I think this chimps don't like snakes, by the way. So, for example, if you take a chimp that's never seen a snake and you show it a snake, it is not happy. It will get the hell away from that snake. If you bring a chimp anesthetized into a room full of chimps, the chimps will all get away from that and then look at the body. They don't like that either. And if you bring a big snake into a chimp cage, even if the chimps have never seen it, like they'll get away from it and then stare at it. And chimps out in the wild, if they see a big snake, they'll stand there and they have a noise that means something like, holy crap, that's a big snake, It actually means that technically, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But they stand away from it, and then they make this noise, which means, oh my God, look at the snake. And then they'll stand there for like 24 hours looking at the snake. And so the snakes are really, they're super stimuli for chimpanzees. So that's pretty interesting. And this chimp seemed to learn how to take this dead snake and go scare other chimps with it. And that was partly how he established his authority. And and well, there's a threat, and like if I was you and I was around that chimp, I would take that threat seriously because those things are no joke, man. And you see the same thing here with I don't remember what kind of monkey that is, but they're engaged in agonistic behavior, and and there has been, by the way, recent research showing that in higher order primates that there is snake detection circuitry that's built into them, right? So it's not learned. It's deeper than that. Now, for a long time, psychologists knew for a long time that I could make you afraid in a conditioning experiment much faster using a snake or a picture of a snake than a gun or a picture of a gun. So we can learn fear to snakes very rapidly, spiders as well. And so then people thought, well, maybe we were prepared to develop fear to snakes or spiders, that sort of thing. But the more recent research has indicated that it's more than just prepared, is that we have the detection circuitry built right into us. And, well, it's because, well, why wouldn't we? That's really the issue. It's like, it's not really that much of a surprise, unless you think of human beings as a blank slate. And if you think that, then, I don't know, you should crawl out of the 16th century. That's how I would look at it. Because, I mean, that's just gone, that idea. It's so wrong. So maybe you can think about this as a dominance hierarchy, but wolves look for credibility and competence as well, and chimpanzees don't like brutal tyrants, and so we'll talk about it as the hierarchy of authority. And so, well, this is kind of how it starts to develop. You see, well, these girls are negotiating the domestic environment here and how to behave properly and how to share and all that and take turns, and so they're negotiating the hierarchy of authority. And if you're good at reciprocity, it's sometimes you're the authority and sometimes the other person is the authority. That's fair play, right? And so these boys are doing the same thing, and you see they're all smiling away. And so it looks like aggressive behavior, and people who are not very attentive and who are paranoid and who don't like human beings confuse this with aggression, and they forbid it at schools, which is, I know when my kids were going to school, for example, this was quite a while ago now, they were forbidden to pick up snow on the off chance they might throw a snowball. And we know how terrible that is. So what I told my son is that he was perfectly welcome to pelt any teacher he wanted to in the back of the head with a snowball, as long as he was willing to suffer the consequences of doing it. And I don't know if he ever did, but he was certainly happy with the idea, which made me very happy about him. So, yeah. So, you know, kids need to do this. They really, really, seriously need to do this. It's what civilizes them. And that needs to happen between the ages of 2 and 4, because if they're not civilized by the time they're 4, then you might as well just forget it. And that's a horrible statistic, but it's unbelievably well borne out in the relevant developmental literature. Like, there's lots of aggressive 2-year-olds, most of them are male. And if they stay aggressive past the age of 4, they tend to be lifetime aggressive. They make no friends, they're outcasts, they're much more likely to end up antisocial, criminal, delinquent, and in jail. And so, your kids need to be socialized between the ages of 2 and 4. And that's particularly true for the more aggressive males. And most of the aggressive 2-year-olds are male. And that isn't socialization, by the way. So there's a more abstract representation of the same sort of thing. And I'm trying to make the case that the hierarchy of authority emerges out of a game-like matrix, an underlying game-like matrix. And that's one of the things that's so brilliant about Jean Piaget. He figured that out. It's so smart. And he was interested in the biological origin of morality. And he identified it, he traced the origin to play and the emergence of morality out of play. And it's so smart. I just can't believe how smart an idea that was. Because it's the bottom-up construction of morality. Now, Piaget was a constructionist, and to some degree a social constructionist. He underestimated the role of biology. But that doesn't invalidate his theory. It's really easy to put a biological underpinning underneath Piaget's theory. We know the biology well enough to do it quite nicely now. So, I mean, the fact that Panksepp, for example, could identify the play circuit is a really good start with that, right? Because play has been around so long that we have a circuit that's dedicated to it. And so that's a very, very ancient issue. And so, you know, this is very much of an abstraction of a game here. And then, of course, you get the ultimate abstraction in a representation. In a representation like that, where even the landscape of the game is fictional. And of course, we've migrated to a large degree into those sorts of fictional landscapes, fictional books, movies, video games. So it's the same. It's an extension of the same thing. So practice for real life that shades in some cases into real life itself. So, all right. More representations of God the Father. I like these representations. I like the triangle idea. I mean, I don't know why God is wearing a triangular hat. It's kind of a strange fashion choice, but I think it's associated with the idea of the pyramid, and I think that's associated with the idea of the hierarchy of authority. And I think that's why the Egyptians put their pharaohs inside pyramids. I know there's more to it than that, but I think some of that has to do with the notion of this hierarchical structure. You see this now that's speculative, obviously, and I don't want to make too much of it, but I can't help but think that there's something to that. See, that's on the back of the American dollar bill. I like that a lot. That's like the Eye of Horus from the Egyptians. And so the idea here is something like, at the top of the hierarchy is something that is no longer part of the hierarchy. Right? So if you move up the hierarchy enough, what happens is that you develop the ability, as a consequence of moving up that hierarchy, to be detached enough from the hierarchy so you're no longer really part of it, and so that you can move in all sorts of different hierarchies. And the idea here is that the thing that you're really developing is the capacity to pay attention. And I would say, from a mythological perspective, the one thing that seems to compete with the idea of the spoken word as the source of the extraction of habitable order from chaos is the eye, is the capacity to pay attention. So Marduk, for example, the Mesopotamian creator god, who emerged in the hierarchy of Mesopotamian gods and came out at the top, right? He was the victor of the gods. He had eyes all the way around his head, and he could speak magic words. And I really like that. I really like that idea. And the Egyptians developed that idea too, because their god Horus was the eye. Everyone knows the Eye of Horus. That image is so compelling that we still know about it. Everybody has seen the Eye of Horus with a really open pupil. And what the Egyptians learned was that the open eye was what revivified the dead society. It's so smart. So what do if your life isn't in order? Bloody well pay attention. And that isn't the same as thinking. It's a different process. Paying attention, thinking is like the imposition of structure in some sense. I know I'm oversimplifying, But paying attention is something like watching for what you don't know. And so, like, one of the things I often recommend to my clinical clients if they're having trouble with a family member is, number one, shut up. Don't tell them anything about yourself. And I don't mean in a rude way, it's just like, no more personal information. Number two, watch them like a hawk and listen. And if you do that long enough, they will tell you exactly what they're up to. And they will also tell you who they think you are. And then you'll be shocked because they think you're something, generally speaking, that's not like what you are at all. And when they tell you, it's like a revelation to both of you. But attention is an unbelievably powerful force. And you see this in psychotherapy too, because a lot of what you do, and in any reparative relationship, is really pay attention to the other person. Pay attention and listen. And you would not believe what people will tell you or reveal to you if you watch them as if you want to know, instead of watching them so that you'll have your prejudices reinforced. That's usually how people interact. It's like, I want to keep thinking about you the way I'm thinking about you, and so I'm going to filter out anything that disproves my theory. That's not what I'm talking about at all. It's like, I'm going to watch you and figure out what you're up to. Not in a rude way, none of that. I just want to see what's there. And that'll be good for you, probably, and also be good for me. And so, well, so that's the idea that, climbing up a hierarchy of authority can give you vision, and that vision can transcend the actual hierarchy. And I think that's also that's the metaphysical space that an artist occupies. Because artists really aren't in a hierarchy, they're outside of hierarchies. You've watched The Lion King, most of you? Yeah. That's Zazu, the little bird that's the eye of the king. That's the same thing there. So, and that's echoed in this idea as well. So well, that's some more ideas of hierarchies, same idea. This is, right, gold, silver, bronze. Why gold? Gold is the sun. Gold is pure, right? And so the idea is that the thing that's at the top of the hierarchy is incorruptible, because gold doesn't mix with anything else, right? It's this sort of metal that doesn't ever become corrupted. It's a noble metal. It doesn't become corrupted. And so it shines like the sun, and it's associated with what's ever at the top of the hierarchy. And the gold medal is a disc, like the sun, and it's awarded to those people who've occupied the top position and who are manifestations of the ideal. And here's I'll tell you a quick story. So imagine that you're watching an Olympic contest. I found this happens to me very often with gymnastics, because the gymnasts are so absolutely unbelievable, So you watch a gymnastic performance, and the person's out there bouncing around like, you can't even imagine doing it. They're so perfect at it. So you see this person, they're going through this routine, they're just absolutely spectacular and flawless at it. At the end they stop and everybody claps, and they're all excited to see what a human being can do, and that's why we're in the audience watching, because we want to see what a human being can do. And the judges go like 9.8, 9.8, 9.8, and everybody's thrilled. And then the next contestant comes out, and it's like, well, they're just basically screwed, right? It's like, this person came out there and was perfect. How are you going to top that? That's an interesting question, because this is a representation of what you do to top perfection itself. And you can do it. And here's how you do it. And you know this, even though you don't know you know it. So let's say the next contestant comes out and they're kind of shaky because it's like, oh man, the bar's being raised high. So what they do is they put themselves right on the edge of chaos. And you can tell by watching them that they are one bloody fraction of a second from catastrophe. They're pushing themselves farther than they've ever gone in the direction of their perfection. And everyone in the room is so tense they can hardly stand it, right? You can hear a pin drop, and that person is flipping around, and it's just right on the edge of catastrophe. And at the end, they go like this, and there's that gesture of triumph that goes along with that. And everybody rises in one instant and just claps like mad. It's like, well, why? What are you doing? What are you doing when you're doing that? Right? You can't even help it. It grabs you right in the core of your being, and you stand up, and it's an act of worship. That's what it is. And you saw someone go beyond their perfection into the domain of chaos and establish order right in front of your eyes. And you're so thrilled about that. You're happy to be alive, and everyone's celebrating it all at the same time. And it's an absolutely amazing thing. And that's what, well, sometimes that's what this represents, and sometimes that's what this represents. And that's what we're trying to get at, because that's at the pinnacle of the hierarchy, right? Not only are you doing what you should be doing, but you're doing it in a way that increases the probability that you'll do it better the next time you do it. And then you could say, Here's another thing to think about along the same lines. And I know we haven't got to Adam and Eve yet. You tell your kids to play fair, right? You say, it's not whether or not you win, it's how you play the game. And you say that and you don't really know what you mean. You feel kind of stupid saying it even though you know it's true. And your kid looks at you like there's something wrong with you because he doesn't know what you're talking about either. But you know it's true. And so here's why it's true. Life isn't a game. It's a set of games. And the rule is, never sacrifice victory across the set of games for victory in one game. Right? And that's what it means to play properly. You want to play so that people keep inviting you to play. Because that's how you win. Right? You win by being invited to play the largest possible array of games. And the way you do that is by manifesting the fact that you can play in a reciprocal manner every time you play, even if there's victory at stake. And that's what makes you successful across time. And we all know that, and we even tell our kids that, but we don't know that we know it. And so we're not adapting ourselves to the game and victory in the game. We're adapting ourselves to the meta game and victory across the set of all possible games. And that's what that's exactly what as far as I can tell, that's exactly what this is aiming at too, that's the same idea, that there's a mode of being that transcends the particularities of the localized contest. That's the other way to think about it. And to act morally is not to win today's contest at the expense of the rest of possible contests. And again, I don't see that as something that's arbitrary. It's not relativistic. There's an absolute moral stance there, and everyone recognizes it. And I also think it's the key to success. And I would also say it's very much akin in a strange way. Like the person who is the master at being invited to play the largest possible number of games is also the same person. I haven't quite figured out the precise relationship between these two, is also the same person that goes out forthrightly to conquer the unknown before it presents itself as the enemy at the door. They're the same thing. Now, I haven't figured out why that is exactly, but well, I'll figure it out eventually, and when I do, I'll tell you. Well, if you're interested. So, okay. So here's some other ideas of God as hierarchical authority figure. So strip the religious preconceptions off what you observe, and just look at what you see. Well, look, there's primate looking upward at dominant figure. That's what you see there. Now, it's very interestingly symbolically represented because you have God the Father there with the cross. And I think what that means, as far as I can tell, is that there's a recognition there in the image that the person who's most dominant is the one has the most authority, is the one who's voluntarily accepted the suffering that's part of being. And that's what that picture represents. It's like the authority holds that and says, this is what you have to accept, and that transfixes the viewer because of the fact that it's true. And you think, well, is that true? Okay, well, think about it this way. Do you like brave people or do you like cowards? Well, that's pretty straightforward. And what's the ultimate act of bravery? It's to come to terms with the fact that you're mortal and limited, and to live forthrightly regardless. Well, obviously, that's at the core of what's admirable. And why would we presume that that's not the case? We act as if that's the case. It's what everyone dreams and wishes that they could do. I mean, assuming that, you know, you've dispensed with the idea that you're going to be immortal, I suppose that might be worth wishing for too, or perhaps not. Immortal is a very long time. But you certainly want this, and that image says, well, this is what you should be. And you know, we've got that same opening into the sky going on in that image that I showed you before. It's like this is a transcendent truth that constantly remanifests itself across time and space. And Jung would say, it's built into your psyche, that image. Now, you know, there are elements of it that are culturally constructed. It wouldn't necessarily have to be the cross, although the cross is a very old symbol. It's far older than its use in Christianity, and it's been used in many, many religious representations. But that echoes, the soul echoes with that. You know, and well, and then there's Moses up there on the mount receiving the law. And so we'll talk a lot more about that when we get to Exodus. But if we get to Exodus. So, well, look, where does it happen? Well, on a mountain. Well, that's a pyramid. That's up, right? That's up. It's up. It's up in the stratosphere. It's up in the sky where you look upward. Okay, and then so what's happening to Moses? Well, here's a bit of a clue, as far as I can tell. I figured this out partly again by reading Jean Piaget, because one of the things that Piaget said about kids was that they first learn to play a game, but they don't know what the rules are. Meaning that if you have a bunch of kids together, they can play a game. But if you take one of the kids out of the game when they're young, say 6, and you say what are the rules, they can only sort of give you a representation. So you take 6-year-old 1 and he'll tell you some of the rules, and 6-year-old 2 will tell you different rules, and you know, 6-year-old 3 will tell you different rules. But if you put them all together, they can play. So they have the knowledge embodied either individually or in the group. The knowledge is there to be extracted. Well, then they get a little older, they can extract the rules. And then they start to play by the rules. And then Piaget's last step was, well, it isn't just that kids play by the rules, it's that they learn that they can make the rules. And he thought about that as moral progression. First you can play, then you can play by the rules. Then you learn, maybe, because he didn't think everyone learned this, that you're actually the master of the rules. That doesn't mean the rules are arbitrary, but it means that you can be the generator of the rules, assuming that you know how to play the game. And he thought about that as a moral progression. And then I thought, well, that's exactly what happened to Moses in the story of Exodus, because Moses is out there leading all those Israelites around, and like, they don't have a law, they don't have a lawgiver, they have a tradition, and they're all like crabby because, well, they're in a desert. It's like, they were in a tyranny, but now they're in a desert. It's like, that's no improvement. So they're really getting pretty bitchy about it. And so they're worshiping false idols and having one catastrophe after another, and they get Moses to judge their conflicts. And so he does that for God only knows how long. Forever. Crabby Israelites come to Moses and bitch at him. It's like, well, he did this and she did that. And so then he has to figure out how to make peace. And he does that so long that one of his, I think it's his father-in-law, tells him he has to stop doing it because he's going to exhaust himself. Well, then you think, well, what's happening? Well, and I'm not assuming that this is like a literal historical story. I think, again, it's a condensation. Well, any group has a set of customs, just like a wolf pack does. And so then the customs are being manifest, and someone who's a genius is watching and thinking, okay, well, what's the rule in this situation? What's the rule in this situation? What's the rule in this situation? And then in his imagination, the rules turn into a hierarchy, and then he goes up on the mountain and he goes bang, and he thinks, oh my God, here's the rules that we've been living by all this time. And that's the revelation of the commandments. Well, and you think, well, how else could it be? You think the rules came first and obeying them came second? It's like, no, the rules come first. Sorry, the actions come first. The obeying them comes first. And then you figure out what everybody's up to, and you say, hey, look, this is what you've been up to all along. And everybody goes, oh, yeah, that seems to make sense. And if it didn't, who would follow them? No one was going to follow them if they don't match what's already there. You just think about that as unjust. And so that's portrayed here as a cataclysmic human event. It's like, oh my God, we've been chimpanzees. We've been in this hierarchy of authority for so long. We have no idea what we're doing. And all of a sudden, poof, it burst into revelatory consciousness. And we could say, here is the law. And you say, well, is it given by God? Well, hey, it depends on what you mean by God. We could start with that presupposition, but it's not like it just came out of nowhere. It took and this is something else Nietzsche observed so interestingly. And he said, you know, that a moral revelation was the consequence of a tremendously long process of initial construction and then formulation. Thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years of custom, of building custom, before you get the revelation of the articulated law. And that's a description of the pattern that works. And let's say, well, what's the pattern that works? It's the game that you can play with everybody else day after day with no degeneration. And that's another thing Piaget figured out that's so brilliant, and that's his idea of the equilibrated state. It's an extension of Immanuel Kant's idea about the universal maxim, right? Act in a way so that each action could become a universal rule. That was Kant's fundamental moral maxim, and Piaget put a twist on that. He said, no, that's not exactly it. It's act in such a way that it works for you now, and next week, and next month, and next year, and 10 years from now, and so that while it's working for you, it's also working for the people around you and for the broader society. And that's the equilibrated state, and you could think about that as an intimation of the kingdom of the city of God on earth. It's something like that. And it's based on this idea that a morality has to be iterable. And, you know, there's been lots of simulations online already, artificial intelligence simulations of trading games, right? I mean, the people who've been studying the emergence of moral behavior, say in artificial intelligence systems, have already cottoned on to the idea that one of the crucial elements to the analysis of morality is iterability. You can't play a degenerating game because it degenerates. Like, obviously, you want to play a game that at least remains stable across time. And God, if you could really get your act together, maybe it would slowly get better. And of course, that's what you'd hope for your family, right? That's what you're always trying to do, unless you're completely hell-bent on revenge and destruction. It's like, is there a way that we can continue to play together that will make playing together even better the next day? That's what you're up to. And, well, I don't see anything arbitrary about that. And part of it, and this is also why I think that bloody postmodernists are so incorrect, because, you know, they say something like, there's an infinite number of interpretations of the world, and that's actually true. But then they make a mistake, and they say, well, no interpretation is to be privileged over any other interpretation. It's like, wrong. Wrong. That's where things go seriously off the rails, because the interpretation has to be, and this is the Piagetian objection, is like, if you and I are going to play a game, rule one is we both have to want to play. Rule two is other people are going to let us play. Rule three is we should be able to play it across a pretty long period of time without it degenerating. And maybe rule four is, while we're playing, the world shouldn't kill us. It's like there are not very many games, like you don't send your kids out to play on the superhighway, right? So they're not playing hockey on the superhighway because the world kills them. And so there's an infinite number of interpretations, but there is not an infinite number of solutions. And the solutions are constrained by the fact of the world and our suffering in the world, and then also constrained by the fact that we constrain each other. And so that's where I think that's gone like dreadfully, dreadfully wrong. So, all right. It's really fun to look at these old pictures once you kind of know what they mean. You know, at least that's what I've discovered, is that once I kind of understand the underlying rationale for, I mean, someone worked hard on that. That's an engraving, right? They took a long time making that picture. They're serious about it. And when you understand what it means, you know, all those people, they're prostrate at the revelation of the law. It's like, well, no wonder. It's like, break the law and see what happens. Break the universal moral law, man, and see what happens. You know, I see people in that situation, well, as you all do all the time, perhaps me more than you because I'm a clinical psychologist, you know, and if the people I'm seeing haven't broken the universal law, then you can bloody well be sure that people around them have. It's no joke. Like, you make a mistake and things will go seriously wrong for you. And so it's no wonder that you'd be terrified at the revelation of the structure that governs our being. One of the things that's so remarkable about the Old Testament, this is another thing Nietzsche commented on. He was a real admirer of the Old Testament, not so much of the New Testament. He thought it was a sin for Europe to have glued the New Testament onto the Old Testament, because he thought the Old Testament was a really accurate representation of the phenomenology of being. It's like, stay awake, speak properly, be honest, or watch the hell out, because things will come your way that you just do not want to see at all. And it might not just be you, it might be everyone you know and everything about your culture that is demolished for generation after generation. It's like, stay awake and be careful. And I think that people only don't believe that when they're being hubristic. And I think that most people know that deep in their hearts. You know, when you get high on your horse, that happens fairly often. If you have any sense, you think, geez, I better be careful and tap myself down a fair bit, because if I get too puffed up, man, something's going to come along and take me out at the knees. And everyone knows that. Pride comes before a fall. It's like, if you have any, that's why it says in the Old Testament that fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. It's like, I've never, in all my years as a clinical psychologist, and this is something that really does terrify me, I have never seen anyone ever get away with anything at all, even once. You know, there's that old idea that God has a book, you know, and keeps track of everything in heaven. It's like, okay, you know, maybe it's not a book. Fine. But that is a really useful thing to think about, because, well, and maybe you disagree. Maybe you think people get away with things all the time. I tell you, I've never seen it. What I see instead is that thing happens, right? Someone twists the fabric of reality. And they do it successfully because it doesn't snap back at them that moment. And then like 2 years later, something unravels. And they get walloped and they think, oh my God, that's so unfair. And then we track it. It's like, well, what happened before that? This. Well, and then what? This. And then what? This. And then what? Oh, this. Oh, that's where it went wrong. It's, yeah, because you can't twist the fabric of reality without having it snap back. It doesn't work that way, and why would it? Because what are you going to do? Twist the fabric of reality? I don't think so. I think it's bigger than you. You know, and I think that one of the things that really tempts people is the idea that, well, I can get away with it. It's like, yeah, you try. You see how well that works. It's like you get away with nothing. And that is the beginning of wisdom. And it's something that deeply terrifies me. And, you know, ever since last September, when I came to more like broader public attention, one of the things, I've been terrified of making a mistake, because I certainly know I'm more than capable of making a mistake. And thank God so far, either I haven't made one or no one's found out about it. So, but it's like, you know, we walk on a very thin and narrow edge. And we're very lucky when things aren't degenerating into chaos around us or rapidly moving to far too much order. And it's not an easy thing to stay on that line. And you can tell when you're on that line, because things are deeply meaningful and engaging when you're on that line. But if you're not existentially terrified about the consequences of wavering off that, then you are truly not awake. So, and that's what I see in this picture. You know, it's like, look out, man. Because there are rules. And if you break them, God help you. So one of the things that seems to me the case with regard, I mentioned this in the question period a bit last time, is that one of the things that seems to be actually one of the advantages to gluing the New Testament onto the Old Testament is the idea of a transformation in morality that is analogous to the Piagetian idea that after you learn to play by the rules, you can learn to make the rules, because I think that's actually what happens to some degree in the transition between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Because in the Old Testament, most morality is prohibition. Here are things you shouldn't do. It's like, fair enough. And that's a lot of what you do with your kids. Don't do this, don't do this, don't. Especially when they're happy, you're always going around telling them to stop being so happy, because all they're doing is causing trouble. It's quite painful if you're a parent and you notice that. But the first morality is prohibition, right? Control yourself so that you don't cause too much trouble. And then maybe if you get that down and you're good at it, then the next thing is, well, once you're disciplined, then you can start working towards something that's a positive good. And that's the transformation that seems to me to be fundamentally characteristic of the juxtaposition of the New Testament onto the Old Testament. But in these images, it's still something like serve tradition, serve the Father, psychologically speaking. Support the tradition, because you live on it. There, in the old Mesopotamian story, the Enuma Elish, which you can read about if you're interested in, the original gods, who are really badly behaved, they're like 2-year-olds. In fact, they're a lot like 2-year-olds. They kill the primordial god, Apsu, who's the patriarchal god. They kill him and try to live on his corpse. Well, that's what we all do, right? Because we live on the corpse of our ancestors. You could say we live on the corpse of our culture. It's dead. And that's not a great place to live. So you have to keep revivifying it so the damn thing, stays active and awake. You stay on the corpse for too long, and then the devil or the demon of chaos comes back, and that's what happens in the Mesopotamian story. It's like, don't be thinking that you can stay on the corpse of your ancestors for too long without contributing to the revivification of the system. Because the chaos that all of that holds at bay will definitely come and visit you. And you see that in stories like The Hobbit. Hobbits, they're nice, they like to eat, they're kind of fat, they're short, they're not very bright, they're hubristic. They have no idea what's out there in the broader world. They're protected, if you remember, by the Striders, who are the sons of great kings, who look like tramps. They have nothing but contempt for them. They patrol the borders and keep the bloody hobbits safe. But out there in the periphery, all hell is brewing and chaos is generating and forming. And that's an archetypal story, and that's why people like that story so much. Because that's exactly right. Like, we're the hobbits, and we are protected from chaos by the spirits of our dead ancestors, and we're too damn stupid to know it. And we think, oh, well, we don't need them anymore. And that, to me, that's postmodernism. That's what the bloody universities are doing with the humanities. It's absolutely appalling. And we will pay for it. So, unless we wake up, and hopefully we'll wake up, because that would be better than paying for it, even though being awake is rather painful. So then I had this vision one time, and I kind of portrayed it in this image of what the world was like. And I thought, well, it's not a pyramid. It's not a single hierarchy of authority. That's not what it is. It's an array of hierarchies of authority. So you imagine this sort of infinite plane. And in the infinite plane, there's nothing but pyramids. And inside the pyramids, there are strata of people everywhere, far as you can look. Some of the pyramids are tall. Some of them are short. They overlap. It's endless. The plane is endless. And those are all the positions to which you could rise. And everybody's inside the pyramid, sort of crammed up, trying to move towards the top. And then there's the possibility of sailing across over top of all of them and seeing how the structure itself works. And that's the eye that floats above the pyramid and that sees the structure itself. And the highest order of being is not to be at the top of the pyramid. It's to use the discipline that you attain by striving towards the top of the pyramid to release yourself from the pyramid and move one step up. And I think that's one of the things that's instantiated in the idea of for example, of the Holy Ghost. And I think that's akin to that. That's Sisyphus. And Nietzsche said of Sisyphus, if I remember correctly, that one has to imagine him happy. Well, if there's a rock at the bottom of the hill, then you might as well push it up the hill. And if it rolls back down, well, then you've got something else to do, don't you? You can push the damn rock back up the hill. And there's no shortage of rocks to push up the hill. And that's what we're built for anyways. And so let's go out and push some damn boulders up the hill. And then maybe we could have enough self-confidence and enough respect for ourselves that we wouldn't have to turn to hatred and revenge and try to take everything down, because I think that's the alternative. So he's not weak. That's one thing you can say about him. The same idea represented there, right? That's Atlas, who voluntarily takes the world on his shoulders. It's like the idea of Christ taking the sins of the world on his shoulders. It's exactly the same notion, which is the notion that you should be able to recognize in yourself all the horror of humanity and take responsibility for it, because that's what that means. And the thing that's so interesting about that is that if you can recognize in yourself all the horror of humanity, you will instantly have a hell of a lot more respect for yourself than you did before you did that. Because there's some real utility in knowing that you're a monster. Now, and just because you're a monster doesn't mean you have to be a monster, but it's really useful to know that you are one. So, one of the things that Jung knew, and this is something that I find so amazing about his writings, and I think something that really distinguishes him, for example, from Joseph Campbell, who talked about following your bliss, is like Jung said very clearly that the first step to enlightenment is the encounter with the shadow. And what he meant by that was, everything horrible that human beings have done was done by human beings, and you're one of them. And so if you don't understand that, and to understand that really means to know how it was that you could have done it, and that's a shattering thing. To try to imagine that, to try to imagine yourself as someone who's engaged in medieval torture, to see how you could in fact do that. You're never the same after you learn that. But being never the same after learning that is unbelievably useful, because when you understand that that's what you're like, then you're a whole different creature. And I don't think, and this is something I did learn from Jung, is that you cannot be a good person until you know how much evil you contain within you. It is not possible. And it's partly because you just don't have any potency. Like, if you're just naive, if you're just nice, if you'd never hurt anyone, you'd never hurt a fly, you don't have the capability for any of that, why would anyone ever take you seriously? You're a domestic animal at best, you know, and a rather contemptible one at that. And it's a very strange thing, because you wouldn't think that the revelation of the capacity for evil is a precondition for the realization of good. But I believe, first of all, why would you be serious enough to even attempt to pursue the good unless you had some sense of what the consequence was of not doing it? You have to be serious about these sorts of things. It's not the game of a child, right? It's the game of a fully developed adult. And I learned this in part when I had little kids. I wrote a chapter from my new book called Never Let Your Children Do Anything That Makes You Dislike Them. And why was that? And I wrote that after I knew I was a monster. And I thought, I'm going to make sure I like my kids. I'm going to make sure they behave around me so that I like them. Because I'm way bigger than them. And I'm way more cruel than they are. And I've got tricks up my sleeve that they cannot even possibly imagine. And if they irritate me, I will absolutely take it out on them. And if you don't think that you're the sort of person that would do that, then you are the sort of person who is doing it. You know, we're not going to get to Adam and Eve, haha. I watched this great documentary once called Hitman Hart, and it was about Bret Hart, who was the most famous Canadian in the world for a while. And he was a Worldwide Wrestling Federation wrestler, you know, and he was a good guy. And he came from this famous family of wrestlers who all came from Alberta. I think there were 7 brothers who were wrestlers and 7 sisters, and all the sisters married wrestlers. And they were all offspring, children of Stu Hart, who was a wrestling impresario like 40 years ago. And it was such a cool documentary, because I was always wondering, why in the world do people watch wrestling and believe it, you know? Believe it. Do you believe movies when you go watch them? It's like, that's a hard question to answer. Well, you're there, you do. And so if you're watching wrestling and you're a wrestling fan, do you believe it? Well, it isn't a matter of belief, it's a matter of being engaged in a drama. And there are different levels of drama, right? So let's say Worldwide Wrestling Federation drama is not the most sophisticated form of drama. Okay, but I'm not being a smart aleck when I'm saying that. There's drama of different sophistication for different people. And that's also why religious truths exist at multiple levels simultaneously, right? There's got to be something in it for everyone. And that's a hard belief system. That's a hard system to put together. Something for the unbelievably sophisticated, and something for the common person. Okay, so we have wrestling, and Bret Hart was a good guy, and he fell into the archetype of being a good guy, and that's partly what the story's about. It was a bit too much for him. But one of the things that he laid out so carefully was because he figured that 120 million people knew him, something like that, and that everywhere he went, he was treated like a hero, and he found that quite a burden, as you can imagine if you think about it. But he portrayed what was happening in the wrestling ring as classic good against evil, but not conceptualized and discussed, right? Embodied, fought out, acted out, you know, like Thor and the Hulk, except like right in front of you. And so, well, that's exactly this sort of thing. I mean, we could consider hockey more sophisticated than wrestling, perhaps. And as I said, I'm not being a critic of these. I'm not being critically minded about these things. I understand their purpose, and I would highly recommend that documentary. It's a brilliant documentary. But it's the same thing. It's a silver cup, right? It's like, there's the hero of the team. That's the hero of the teams. You know, here's something cool. If you're the fan of the Toronto Blue Jays, or the Toronto Maple Leafs, of course this hardly ever happens to you if you're the fan of the Toronto Maple Leafs, because they always lose. But if you're watching a game and your team wins and we take your testosterone levels, then they went up. And if you watch the Toronto Maple Leafs and they lost and you're a fan, then your testosterone levels go down. So that's pretty damn funny. You know, I mean, really, don't you see how deeply instantiated this is in people? I mean, it bloody well alters your biochemistry, like your testosterone levels. It's all, oh, my team lost. You know, it's like there'll be nothing in it for the wife tonight. You know, so. Yeah, God. Well, this is the cosmos, I think, from the phenomenological perspective. And one of the things that has come to my realization is that this is real. This is real. It's not a metaphor. It's way deeper than a metaphor. The most real things about life are the place you don't know and the place you know. And you could say, well, that's explored territory and unexplored territory. That's real, and it's been around forever. Back to the lobsters. You know, if you put lobsters in a new place, the first thing they do is go around their territory, finding places to hide, and also making a burrow. So the first thing they do is establish what they know against what they don't know. And that's real. It's real from the Darwinian perspective. And we're going to say that what's real from the Darwinian perspective is plenty real enough, because we're alive and everything, and so that sort of thing matters. It's like, well, that's what this is. The Taoist symbol, that's what it says. It says, what is experience made of? Eternally. That's easy. Chaos and order. And in every bit of chaos, there's the possibility of order. And in every bit of order, there's the possibility of chaos. And that's the way, right? That's the path of life. That's life itself. And where you're supposed to be is right on the border between the two of those. And why is that? Stable enough, engaged enough, right? So not only are you doing what you should be doing, you're doing it in a way that increases the probability that you'll do it better tomorrow. And you can tell when you're doing that because you're engaged. You're in the right time and place. And your neurology tells you that. That's what meaning is. That's what transcendent meaning is. And that's so cool because I also think that that is the antidote to existential suffering. The antidote to existential suffering is to be at the right place at the right time. And you know, you want to get technical about it. Okay, anxiety and pain. That's the reality of existential suffering. Okay, so let's say you're in the right place at the right time. What happens to you biochemically? Dopaminergic activation. What does that do? Suppresses anxiety, and it's analgesic. Now, it's more than that because it also produces positive emotion and the desire to move forward, and it underlies creativity. And so not only do you get the positive engagement from a neurochemical perspective, you get the analgesia and you get the and you get the reduction of anxiety. So it's not hypothetical. And it is the case that the dopaminergic systems, those are the exploratory systems, unbelievably ancient and archaic, are activated when you're optimally positioned to be incorporating new information, which is what human beings do, because we're information foragers. And so we want to be secure, but building on our security at the same time. And then we want to do it for ourselves, we want to do it for other people, we want to do it for our families, we want to do it for broader society. We want to bring the whole world together in alignment to do that, and that's meaningful. And God only knows what we could do about the suffering of the world if we did that. You know, we have no idea what we could do if we started doing things properly. And maybe so many of the things that dismay us about life, we could stop. I mean, we stopped a lot of them in the last 100 years. You know, things are a lot better than they were 100 years ago. Obviously, they're not perfect. But 100 years ago, 120 years ago, man, you know, the average person in the Western world lived on less than $1 a day in today's dollars. It's like, you just try that for a week and see how much fun that is. So, the Taoists, well, what is this? Well, this is the precosmogonic chaos out of which the Word of God extracted habitable order at the beginning of time. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. And that chaos, we'll talk a bit more about that later, I guess, because it's a very complicated thing to describe. But it's certainly the thing that when you encounter, the chaos is what you encounter when the Twin Towers fall. Right? You remember what that was like, right? So it was September 10th. Well, that was the world. Everyone knew what the world was like. And then it was September 11th, and everyone walked around dazed for 3 days because the buildings fell. But so what? You can see a building fall. You can understand what happens when a building falls. So then what's going on with the being dazed? Well, it's the chaos that underlies our habitable order manifested itself when those buildings collapsed. It was a brilliant act of terrorism. And everyone was frozen and curious because that's how we react to that sort of thing. It's like the shark. You know, remember that famous movie poster for Jaws with the woman swimming on the top of the water and that terrible Leviathan shark underneath coming up to take her out. Well, that's life, man. That's the world. And now and then you see that. And when something falls like the Twin Towers fall, you remember that the ocean below you, the abyss, right, the primordial abyss, that bloody thing is deep. And you're fragile. And that happens when someone betrays you, and it happens to you when your dreams fall apart. You encounter that chaos again from which the world is extracted, and then you're called upon to act out attention and the word in order to bring the world back into order. And none of that is superstitious. None of that is superstitious. None of that's even metaphorical. It's real. It's more real than anything else. And I think the reason for that in part is that it's been this way forever. Right? As long as there's been life, this has been the rule of life. And that's the cosmos, that's reality, that's what we inhabit. And so one of the things, you know, the so-called new atheists, and I don't want to go on a tangent about new atheists because I think atheists are often remarkably honest and very consistent in their analysis. But I just don't think they're taking the problem seriously, man. Like, I don't think they take their evolutionary theorizing nearly with the seriousness that it necessitates. And I don't think that you can dispute the proposition that the longer something has had a selection effect on life, the more real it is. It's the fundamental axiom of Darwinian biology. And I think the Darwinian world is more real than the physical world. That was the argument that I was trying to have with Sam Harris, and I didn't do the world's best job of that, although it went not too bad the second time. But it's not something to be taken lightly. It's a very serious, profound, and meaningful proposition. And people act it out and want to act it out whether they know it or not. That's Marduk. So the story of Marduk, I'll just give it to you very briefly. Tiamat and Apsu are locked in embrace at the beginning of time. Goddess of salt water, god of fresh water, together. Chaos and order, right? They give rise, masculine and feminine, they give rise to the world of the elder gods. And those are, to me, they're primordial motivational forces. They're something like that. And their rage and their lust and their love and all these things that possess us that are there forever. And they're out in the world acting. And they carelessly slay Apsu, their father. And they're making a racket, and then they kill Apsu. And then Tiamat gets wind of that. And that's Tiamat right there, by the way. She's kind of a rough-looking creature. And she's the mother of all things. And so she's not very happy about this. Her children have destroyed structure itself. Plus, they're noisy and careless. And so she thinks, all right, just like Noah, just like the God that brings the flood to Noah, exactly the same idea. Tiamat comes back and says, yeah, okay, enough is enough. I'm going to take you out. And she makes this battalion of monsters and puts the worst monster there is at the head of the battalion. His name is Kingu. He's like a precursor to the idea of Satan. And she lets the gods know, hey, I'm coming for you. And so they're not very happy about this because they're gods, but like, yeah, she's chaos itself, right? She gave birth to everything. This is no joke. And so they send one god out after another to confront her, and they all come back with their tails between their legs. There's no hope. And then one day there's a new god that emerges, and that's Marduk. And the gods know, as soon as he pops up, they know he's something new. Remember, and this is happening while the Mesopotamians are assembling themselves into one of the world's first great civilizations. So all the gods of all those tribes are coming together to organize themselves into a hierarchy to figure out what proposition rules everything. And so Marduk is elected by all the gods, and he says, look, I'll go out there and I'll take on Tiamat, but here's the rule. From here on, you follow me. I determine destiny. I'm the top god. I'm the thing at the top of the hierarchy. And all the other gods say, hey, look, no problem. You get rid of chaos, we do exactly what you say. Now, Marduk, he has eyes all the way around his head, and he speaks magic words. Those are his primary attributes. And so he takes a net, and he goes out to confront Tiamat. And he encloses her in a net, which I think is so cool because it's an encapsulation, right? It's a conceptual encapsulation. He encloses chaos itself in a conceptual structure. He puts it in a net, and then he cuts her into pieces, and he makes the world. And then he creates human beings to inhabit that world and to serve the gods. And he creates human beings out of the blood of Kingu, the worst of the demons. And that took me, it's a Colin DeYoung, who was a student of mine, helped me figure that out. I thought, geez, that's pretty damn pessimistic. It's like, what exactly, it's like a fall metaphor. It's like the idea of original sin, but our joint conclusion with regards to that was that human beings are the only creatures in creation that can truly deceive, right? We have the capacity for evil, just like it says in the Adam and Eve story. We can actually do that, and that's why we're made out of the blood of Kingu, the king of the demons. We are the thing that can deceive, that can twist the structure of reality. Well, so Marduk. Now, the Mesopotamians had an emperor, right? And the emperor was the avatar of Marduk. That's what made him emperor. He was only an emperor if he was going to be Marduk. He had to be a good Marduk, which meant he had to confront Tiamat, chaos, and cut her up and make order out of her pieces. And what the Mesopotamians used to do at the New Year's celebration, they'd go outside their walled city, and that's explored territory versus unexplored territory. They'd go outside their walled city into chaos, and they'd bring all the statues that represented the gods, and they'd act this out. Because they're trying to figure something out, right? They're trying to figure out what this means. They're acting it out. And then they'd take their emperor, and the priest would make him kneel, and they'd take all his king uniform off, his emperor uniform off, and make him kneel and humiliate him and nail him with a glove and say, okay, how were you not a good Marduk this year, right? And then he'd recount all the ways that he was inadequate in confronting chaos, and then they'd do the celebration, and Marduk would win, and the king would go sleep with a royal prostitute. And the reason for that was, it's the same idea as St. George pulling the virgin from the dragon. It's exactly the same idea, that if you encounter the reptilian chaos, you can extract something out of it with which, if you unite, you produce creative order. That's what they were acting out. And that was the basis for the Mesopotamian idea of sovereignty. It's so smart. It's so unbelievably smart. And, the Mesopotamians had a massive influence on the civilizations that then had a massive influence on us. It's one of the stories of how the notion of sovereignty itself came to be. It's the evolution of the idea of God. That's one way of thinking about it. But even more importantly, it's the evolution of the idea of the redemptive human being, right? And that's taken to its one of its conclusions, well, in the story of Buddha, but also in the story of Christ, the idea of the perfect individual. And the notion is, well, that's the word that speaks truth into chaos at the beginning of time to generate habitable order that is good. That's the story. And so with that, let's see. I'll just show you these pictures because they're so interesting. Once you know what they mean, they're so cool. That's a symbol of infinity. Well, that's Hercules and the Hydra. Well, what's life like? You cut off one head. What happens? 7 more grow, right? Well, what do? Run home? Well, no, that's not what you do. This is what you do. You fight it. It's the chaos that generates partial chaos. It's the ultimate chaos that generates partial chaos. But that chaos also is what revivifies life, because otherwise it would just be static. Mercury, the head of the Hydra, right? Freezes you. That's St. George. He's doing it peacefully, which is so interesting, right? He's got a beatific look on his face in that particular representation. Another St. George, right? The Virgin in the background. I think that's St. Anne, if I remember correctly. St. George, he's the patron saint of England. Here's an interesting one. This actually sheds light on the human proclivity for warfare. St. George, that's a Muslim soldier. It's really easy to transform the enemy into the dragon, right? Because the enemy is often the predator, and we do that instantaneously, right? Without a second thought. And so then we can go to war morally, because why not take out the snakes? Well, you know, the problem is, where are the snakes? Well, maybe they're outside, and maybe they're not. Maybe they're in this room, and even worse, maybe they're in you. And that's wisdom, when you know that they're in you. Why wouldn't she be happy about that? Especially if she had a child, right? Seriously. And that's Horus, right? The god of vision. And he was a falcon, because falcons have great vision, and they fly above everything and they can see everything. And so that was the Egyptian creator god, Horus. And I'll tell you the story about Horus at some point as well. Now, here's some pictures that demonstrate what I had described as the emergence of, let's say, the meta-hero out of the hero. So there's the person you admire, and then there's the set of people that you admire, and then there's the meta set of admirable people and the extraction of that ideal. As far as I can tell, that's just what's portrayed in these images. That's a great one. It's a very sophisticated image. You see the two sides of Christ's face are not symmetrical. One's God and one's man. That's what that icon means. And so the fully developed person in this representation is one of the oldest representations of this sort that we know. The idea is that there's the human person in his ordinariness, let's say, and then there's this kinship with the divine that's associated with the willing adoption of the responsibility of mortal being. And that produces this union, and then it's manifest in a book, right? Because that's speech, and it's associated with the sun, right? It's the proper way of being. And that's a perfect example, I think, of the emergence of the archetype out of the multitude. That's what it looks like to me. And so, I guess now we're done with Genesis 1, and that took 3 lectures, but God's complicated, you know? That's the thing. So, thank you, and next week, by all appearances, that's where we are. So, we've got 20 minutes for questions.
So in the past, I've done some work with Big Brother, Big Sister, and whatever. That being said, the most common story I tend to hear from conflicted youth is that they're raised in a single-family home, usually with a mom. Dad is either on the picture, an alcoholic, whatever. So we have this child who is trying to seek ways to make himself healthy and empower himself in the ways that a healthy father should have done so, between the formative years of like 1 to 4. So I think you know where I'm going with this. Let's say for someone who's born without like a good father figure, where would they go out in the world, or like what spheres of influence would they try to expose themselves to like gain access to that fountain of health and knowledge that a good father figure should have provided them to in the first place?
Okay, well, partly, I mean, certainly to some degree, a good mother can provide that, right? To some degree. Although it's hard for one person to be everything.
Right.
And I think one of the conundrums that face women, and this is a tough one, and this is why I think women are higher in trait agreeableness and higher in trait negative emotion, is that, the primary problem that a woman has with an infant is why not throw it out a window? Because it's very annoying, right? I mean, it's there all the time. It's constant demand. It's absolutely constant demand, tremendous dependency. And so a woman has to be tilted towards mercy. That's how it looks to me.
Right.
And especially it's so important during especially the first year when children are so unbelievably vulnerable. And so I think it's very difficult for women to be merciful like that and to make the shift to encouraging disciplinarian. I think that's a very difficult thing for people to do simultaneously. Although, people, I'm not saying that women are always only merciful and men are always only encouraging disciplinarians, but things do sort themselves out to some degree like that. And I think also the biochemical transformations that accompany pregnancy and childbirth and lactation also tilt a mother towards that as well. Because she has to really love that little thing, right? It's number one, no matter what it demands. And then telling it what to do and making sure it's behaving properly, that's a whole different issue. Now, but the kids who lack fathers, I mean, first of all, they can find that to some degree in their friends. And that's often what fatherless boys do in particular. They go into gangs. And they generate the missing masculinity in the gang. Well, that's not so good because, like, what the hell do they know? Yeah. They don't know anything, right? They're just stupid kids, and they're like 15 years old, and their testosterone is pumping, and they're trying to get the hell away from their mother, which is what they're supposed to do. And they're not in the right position to exercise any authority over themselves. So that's not good. They can find it in education. They can find it in books. They can find it in movies. They can find it in sports heroes and so forth, because the image of the father is fragmented and distributed among the community. But it's very, very difficult to not have a father.
Right.
And one of the things that we're doing in our society, which I think it's absolutely appalling, is that we're making the case that all families are equal. It's like, sorry, no, wrong. And there's no empirical data supporting that proposition, by the way. It's much better for kids to have two parents.
Okay.
Now, who those parents are, that's a whole different issue. But.
Okay, and if I could just add one more thing. How would you answer that question to, let's say, a daughter who was raised without a father? Because she would obviously have different ways of finding those fragments of her missing father than, like, a boy would instead.
All right, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that. Basically, the rest of this is question and answer, and I kind of feel like you can go find that on your own, and I encourage you to do so. I look at, us playing that on here on Real News as an advertisement. You should check out Jordon Peterson's YouTube channel. Check out JordonPeterson.com. The great products like the Future Authoring Program and the Personality Test, all that stuff I think it's really cool. So I wanted to share the resource with you all. I hope you're having a great Saturday night. Lots of great things on the horizon with the great state of Tennessee and with Real News. Make sure, as you can see down below you, it says there, Real News Monday through Friday at 10 a.m. So make sure you check it out right here on the Real News Facebook page, or if you're watching on YouTube or Twitch or any of the other places that this video gets put. But I really appreciate anybody who either watched that all the way through or picked it up and watched it to here. You saw in there some of the pictures. The reason I have this picture here, it's usually in the background somewhere. Sometimes it's down here or over there, but that's St. George. And I really like the idea of emphasizing in the culture, bravery, going out there and facing the unknown with bravery, with courage, and with your shoulders back and your head held high. I don't know. Maybe it's because I'm a dude. I have no idea, but I gravitate towards that story and that narrative, and I keep this picture of St. George killing the dragon and getting the girl and as motivation for myself. And I hope that story, that narrative, or in this video maybe can help you in times where you have dragons. And I know that's something that we've all been dealing with, even right now, with what's going on with the coronavirus and people being out of work and stuff like that. So I hope you enjoyed the video. And like I said, check out JordonPeterson.com and Jordon Peterson on YouTube. You just search for him, you can find it. Remember, real news, Monday through Friday at 10 a.m. This has been David Shine Thompson showing the Biblical Series 3, God and the Hierarchy of Authority. Thank you so much for watching. This has been Real News. We'll see you next time.